Hey everyone, is this section from Baruch Knei-Paz's book, The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky? It's from the chapter on social revolution, which is about Trotsky's ideas, I guess, about the construction of socialism in the 1920s. I just read the section on war communism. Now I'm reading about the period of the new economic policy. So here we are. Whatever the motivations, pragmatic or ideological, for the introduction of war communism in 1918, there can be no doubt as to the reasons which led to the turnabout of 1921 and which culminated in the new economic policy. Although later some of those, particularly Bukharin, who defended the new economic policy, appeared to do so out of personal ideological inclinations, the immediate reasons for the change in policy were purely practical. Footnote: for a brief account of Bukharin's political and economic views, see Sidney Heitman, Between Lenin and Stalin, Bukharin, in Leopold Lebed's Revisionism, published in 1962. Revisionism is the first book to deal comprehensively with the intellectual history of Marxist movements, with the political efficacy of Marxist theory, modifications of it that were concealed, denied, or transformed into open, quote, heresy, new rationalizations of the orthodox establishment, and frontal attacks on revisionists who challenged that orthodoxy. The complex revolution of Marxist thought is viewed against its historical background in relation to the theoreticians responsible for much of it: Bernstein, Trotsky, Bukharin, Lukács, Ernst Bloch, Luxemburg, and others. Various essays discuss the significance of and prospects for revisionism with the communist bloc, as well as its effects on the, quote, new left outside the bloc. The authors, all experts in communism's intellectual history, include Robert North, Zbigniew Zerman, S.V. Utichin, Eugen Rula, Daniel Bell, William E. Griffith, and Melvin Krohn. Back to the text. An excellent biography of Bukharin is now available. Stephen F. Cohen, Bukharin and the Bolshevik Revolution, a political biography. Unfortunately, the biography reached this author too late to be referred to in the present study. The description for this book just says, this classic biography carefully traces Bukharin's rise to and fall from power, focusing particularly on the development of Bukharin's theories and programmatic ideas during the critical period between Lenin's death in 1924 and the ascendancy of Stalin in 1929. End footnote. Or back to the text and footnote. The Soviet economy in 1921 was simply collapsing. Chaos reigned in production and distribution, and large-scale famine led to untold deaths. In part, this was certainly due to the objective factor of the Civil War, but the policies of war communism not only could not cope with the situation, the policies of war communism were in fact preventing recovery. Moreover, the situation was beginning to have political repercussions: peasant riots, strikes by workers, and the traumatic mutiny of sailors at Kronstadt. By the time of this last event, in February-March 1921, Lenin and others had become convinced that a completely new approach, in effect a major retreat, was essential to save the revolution and, of course, the government. The result was the new economic policy, an economic policy which reintroduced private enterprise, particularly private agriculture, but private manufacturing as well, and though leaving the, quote, commanding heights, end quote, of the economy, banking, foreign trade, and large-scale industry in the hands of the state, marked a significant shift away from the ideological goals of Bolshevism. Footnote: For full accounts of full accounts of the NEP are given in the works previously cited by E. H. Carr, Maurice Daub, and Alec Nova. End footnote. Lenin did not succeed in introducing the new economic policy without opposition, and while most of the party eventually fell into line, by the time of Lenin's death in January 1924, a great debate over the future of the Soviet economy and thus that of NEP was unfolding. Footnote: The most complete account of this debate is Alexander Ehrlich, Soviet Industrialization Debate 1924 to 1928, published with Cambridge in 1960. And it doesn't seem like there's any detailed description of the Ehrlich book. See also Moshe Lewin, Russian Peasants and Soviet Power, 1968. The description for Moshe Lewin's Russian Peasants and Soviet Power, a study of collectivization, says, the collectivization of the peasants in the USSR constituted a social upheaval of a totally unprecedented nature. It was one of the most remarkable events of the present century, and it has a history as long as that of Soviet power itself. The idea of a collectivized agriculture, much favored by the leadership after the revolution, had been left in abeyance during the new economic policy period. Interest in the idea and in the collective movement revived at the time of the, quote, grain crisis at the beginning of 1928. It was during this crisis that collectivization of the peasantry and the creation of a powerful kolkhoz and sovkhoz sector began to be taken seriously as a means of solving, at one and the same time, both the formidable problem of grain and the whole, quote, accursed problem, end quote, of relations between the Soviet authorities and the peasants. Back to the text, end footnote. In this debate, Trotsky was to become involved in a characteristically exuberant and direct manner, and it was Trotsky who became the political and ideological leader of that grouping which came to be identified as the left, and which urged not only the rejection of the new economic policy, but a return to the direct path to socialism. Footnote: In what follows, as in the previous section of this chapter, no attempt is made to evaluate Trotsky's economic opinions from a purely or even primarily economic point of view. Within the context of this study, what is of interest is the political or ideological aspect of Trotsky's economic views and the light it throws on his general social and political ideas. End footnote. Trotsky did not, it is true, voice objections when the NEP was first debated and introduced, and seemed to simply go along with the general consensus in the party. Footnote: Ironically, Trotsky was amongst the first to raise a proposal, as early as February 1920, for a change of course which involved, partially at least, an abandonment of war communism. The proposal sticks out from the rest of Trotsky's economic statements and writings, for both before and almost immediately afterward, Trotsky held and propagated views of a completely different nature. On this one occasion, addressing the Central Committee of the party, Trotsky suddenly proposed that the extreme restrictions placed on the peasantry be removed. Trotsky argued that the requisitioning of agricultural products be terminated, that the peasant be allowed to sell freely and make a profit, that industrial products be more widely used as a form of payment. Trotsky expressed the view that the existing restrictions were discouraging the peasant from cultivating his land beyond his own family needs, thus preventing much-needed surplus production. And he concluded that the present policy was not only lowering agricultural production, but also, quote, bringing about the ultimization of the industrial proletariat and threatens to disorganize completely the economic life of the country, end quote. Did Trotsky really have in mind a retreat from more communism and the adoption of a program not unlike that which later came to be identified with the new economic policy? Or was this, as his biographer has suggested, an impulsive emotional reaction to the economic havoc of which Trotsky had suddenly become aware? See Deutscher, The Prophet Armed, page 496. Whatever the case, the proposal was turned down by the Central Committee and Trotsky never raised it again, returning instead to his earlier, much more characteristic views. In his autobiography, recalling his 1920 proposal, Trotsky stated that he had then concluded that, quote, war communism must be abandoned, end quote, and that, quote, to revive our economic life, the element of personal interest must be introduced at all costs, end quote. Trotsky, My Life, Book 2. But this was clearly an attempt to minimize, ex post facto, Trotsky's later opposition to the new economic policy, and thus his differences with Lenin, and cannot be taken as sufficient evidence for a real change of mind, and, in any case, it does not explain the fact that Trotsky dropped the whole idea immediately, never to return to it again. End footnote. It's a big footnote. But from the outset, Trotsky was critical of the NEP's effects on what he considered the essential methods to be followed by a socialist-oriented economy, and Trotsky refused to accept a uniform or extreme application of the new economic policy. Thus, in a memorandum of August 1921 to the Central Committee, Trotsky urged the retention of central all-encompassing planning, in spite of its being in contradiction with the conception of the new economic policy, and demanded the establishment of a, quote, central economic authority, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote, Memorandum to Central Committee on Planning, 7th of August, 1921, end footnote. Thereafter, as before, Trotsky was the leading proponent of comprehensive planning and of Gosplan, the State Economic Planning Commission. Footnote. For this, his views on planning, see Trotsky's Russian collected works, book 25, and footnote. And in the course of time, Trotsky became more and more convinced that while the new economic policy had succeeded in revitalizing agriculture, this was, after all, the new economic policy's main intention. The new economic policy was unable to confront, much less solve, the fundamental problems of the Russian economy, particularly the problem of industrialization. From the end of 1922 onwards, therefore, Trotsky began to expound a position which would come one side of the forthcoming, quote, great debate on the future of the Soviet economy. In a speech in October 1922, Trotsky first raised the idea which would be identified with Trotsky's position, the idea, that is, of, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, end quote. Footnote. The speech was delivered to the 5th Komsomol Congress on the 11th of October 1922, available in Trotsky's collected works, 21. The term, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, end quote, was apparently coined by Vladimir Smirnov, who at that time worked as an economist for Gosplan. It was, of course, used by way of analogy with Marx's concept of, quote, primitive capitalist accumulation, end quote. To my knowledge, the concept of primitive socialist accumulation is most associated with Preobrazhensky. But I don't really know much about Preobrazhensky, so I can't really say more than that. But check out the piece by Hillel Tickton on this channel called "The Social Forces Leading to Bureaucracy." Trotsky's ideas on Trotsky on the social forces leading to bureaucracy, and it's about Trotsky in this period and his relationship with the ideas of Preobrazhensky, but I don't really remember it that well. Anyway, the gist of the speech, or end footnote, the gist of the speech was that the Soviet economy was now at a stage at which it had to begin to lay the foundations of modern industry and thus was in need of capital formation, of the creation of state profits which could be reinvested in industrial development and production. At this time, however, Trotsky had hardly worked out how this was to be done on a large scale, and Trotsky's only proposal was that the working class would have to make sacrifices, presumably in the form of lower wages and longer working hours. However, when he returned to the idea in April 1923 at the 12th Congress of the party, Trotsky made his intentions clear. Footnote. There's no footnote. In the course of a by now for Trotsky recurrent call for planning, Trotsky again claimed that the Soviet economy must set out on a road leading to, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, end quote. But now Trotsky linked this road directly with the elimination, albeit not immediate, of the new economic policy. In effect, Trotsky called for a socialist policy to be waged against the new economic policy, against the private sector. Quoting Lenin that the new economic policy had been established, quote, seriously and for a long time, end quote, Trotsky retorted, quote, but not forever, end quote. It had been introduced, quote, in order to defeat it on its own foundation and to a large extent by using its own methods, end quote. Trotsky. And Trotsky declared that the very successes achieved through the new economic policy, quote, bring us closer to the new economic policy's liquidation, end quote. Implicit, if not explicit, in all this was the view that the time had come to see agriculture as the source of, quote, accumulation, as the basis for industrialization, and to act accordingly. Agriculture, after all, constituted the overwhelming part of the private sector and the main beneficiary of the new economic policy. Trotsky still presented the idea under the guise of planning, but Trotsky's listeners could well understand now that Trotsky was urging not only planning but a major turnabout from the new economic policy. Footnote. Deutscher, the prophet armed, argues that Trotsky was not basically opposed to the new economic policy, but was in favor of a very gradual changeover. However, in the light of Trotsky's subsequent views, this seems too cautious an interpretation of Trotsky's position. Certainly, Trotsky did not come out for the immediate abolition of the new economic policy, but the struggle against the new economic policy, which Trotsky contemplated already in 1923 and thereafter, implied more than a gradual evolution of the socialist as against the private sector. End footnote. In short, Trotsky was telling the party that the foundations for the eventual transition to socialism could not be laid unless the problem of industrialization was directly tackled, and that to postpone this task was to create obstacles to its future execution. Footnote. In this connection, see Trotsky something in Russian of 6th of March, 1923. End footnote. The, quote, scissor crisis, end quote, which had already begun to unfold at the time of the 12th Congress, came to a head in late summer 1923, and in a stark way made conspicuous the fundamental and persisting conflict between agriculture and industry, as well as the difficulties of running a mixed economy. The new economic policy had originally improved the situation of the peasant. Now, however, the rise in industrial prices and the decline in agricultural prices, the separating blades of the, quote, scissors, threatened to undermine anew agricultural production. The reasons for this crisis were primarily the inability of Russian industry, still handicapped and inefficient, to develop sufficiently to produce its own capital, thus seeking it through higher prices. And the relative success of agriculture, greater surplus production meant, of course, lower prices on the market. Politically, the danger of the crisis was that it would arouse the peasant against the regime and throw into disequilibrium the already delicate alliance between peasant and worker on which the regime depended. The reaction of Trotsky to the crisis was to go to the root of the problem. On the 8th of October 1923, Trotsky addressed a letter to the Central Committee in which Trotsky, attributed the deteriorating situation to the lack of an overall economic policy and to the failure to deal with the necessary priorities of the objective situation of the Russian economy. Footnote: the full text of this letter was never published, but lengthy extracts of it appeared in something in Russian. Number 11, 28th of May, 1923. The letter went beyond purely economic issues and was, in fact, a general attack on the structure and leadership of the party. This is the beginning of Trotsky's criticism of party bureaucratization and reflected the political struggle which was emerging already during the last days of Lenin. End footnote. In his view, two failures of an economic nature were paramount: the failure to apply planning seriously and scrupulously, and the failure to undertake a fundamental reform of industry. What was needed now was, quote, manipulative regulation, end quote, and, simultaneously, a long-term policy for the rationalization and modernization of industry. The solution to the agrarian problem lay in the solution to the industrial problem. In any case, in Trotsky's view, the, quote, scissors crisis, having cut the link between the peasantry and industry, was, quote, equivalent to the liquidation of the new economic policy, end quote. Trotsky. Footnote: in a further letter of the 24th of October 1923, Trotsky wrote, quote, I stood and stand on the opinion that one of the most important causes of our economic crisis is the lack of appropriate uniform regulation from above, end quote. Trotsky. In the meantime, as a way of dealing immediately with the crisis, Trotsky urged the lowering of industrial prices rather than the raising of agricultural prices. In this latter connection, see especially his article, O Smichka. Well, the Smichka is about the Peasant Alliance, or I know that word. Published the 20 in Pravda, number 277, 6th of December, 1923, and reprinted as an appendix in Trotsky, Novy Kurs. Towards the end of 1923 and the beginning of 1924, the struggle for power in the party, in the wake of Lenin's illness and death, had already begun in earnest. Partly this took the form of discussion over inter-party structure, to which Trotsky's main contribution was the book, The New Course. Footnote: the book and Trotsky's first criticism of bureaucratization are discussed in chapter 10 below. Simultaneously, however, the main factions began to group themselves around differing economic positions so that future economic policy became the focus of the political struggle. Footnote: the actual political struggle has been described in numerous works, but see especially the accounts by Shapiro, the Communist Party of the Soviet Union, chapters 15 and 16, and R.V. Daniels, The Conscience of the Revolution. I have some pieces by R.V. Daniels and from that book on here, so I'm not going to look that up. But I am going to look up Shapiro's book. And I'm not seeing really any descriptions for it. Anyway, back to the text and footnote. The result was the, quote, Great Debate, which extended until 1928, which concerned all the fundamental issues of the Soviet economy and the Soviet economy's reconstruction. The differences emerged in the debate, were deep and indicated a substantial ideological split. The main spokesman for the right was Bukharin, once an ardent leftist, but now the most extreme defender of the new economic policy. Footnote: in what follows, no attempt is made to do justice either to the quantity or quality of the debate, something which would require much more space than can be devoted to it here. The very brief summaries of the two main positions are meant only to provide the context for Trotsky's views. The main accounts of the debate have already been cited. End footnote. The whole raison d'etre of Trotsky's approach may be said to have been the Peasant Worker Alliance. Bukharin. The whole raison d'etre of Bukharin's approach may be said to have been the Peasant Worker Alliance, which is the Smichka. The main footnote. The main source for Bukharin's views here is his pamphlet, something in Russian that I don't know. End footnote. Bukharin believed that without such an alliance, the Soviet regime could not possibly survive, and Trotsky viewed peasant support especially as so crucial, as that Bukharin was willing to bend over backwards not to do anything which would undermine it. The new economic policy seemed to Bukharin ideal from this point of view since it favored the peasant, but also because it was a framework, Bukharin believed, within which it was possible to develop the state sector without unduly jolting the whole delicate economic structure. Bukharin did not think that the regime could possibly win in a confrontation with the peasants, although Bukharin admitted that the, quote, class struggle cannot be entirely avoided. Bukharin envisaged, however, a prolonged period during which the improvement in agriculture would lead to large-scale rationalization which, in turn, would require cooperation and eventually collectivization. This would naturally bring the peasant nearer the worker and make possible the integration of agriculture within an industrial cooperative economy. In the meantime, as far as industry was concerned, the emphasis should be on efficiency and gradual development. Progress towards socialism would be slow. The phrase Bukharin used was, quote, at a snail's pace, end quote, but surer than an impatient policy of full speed ahead. There was much that was sane and realistic in Bukharin's analysis, but much also that was based on pure optimism. In particular, Bukharin did not explain how industry in a backward country could be made to develop at all unless the major, if not the only source of capital, agriculture, was exploited and dislocated. The criticism of Bukharin and of the new economic policy as well formed the basis of the position of the left, whose main theoretical spokesman was Preobrazhensky. Footnote. Preobrazhensky's major work is the Novaya Ekonomika. The main arguments of the book first appeared in the form of articles published in 1924 in Vestnik Kommunisticheskoy Akademie. The work has been translated into English as The New Economics, with an introduction by Alec Nova. On Preobrazhensky, besides the works previously cited, see also the article by Alexander Ehrlich, Preobrazhensky and the Economics of Soviet Industrialization, published in Quarterly Journal of Economics, February 1950. End footnote. Preobrazhensky took up the concept of, quote, primitive socialist accumulation and concentrated directly on the fundamental dilemma of the backward society, where to find capital resources for industrial development. In Preobrazhensky's opinion, the unavoidable reply to this was, among the peasants. The socialist or state sector was both too small and too undeveloped to provide more than a token flow of capital from within itself. Besides, in Preobrazhensky's view, a workers' government could not expect the workers to bear the brunt of the sacrifices necessary. Only the private sector, which meant primarily the peasants, could be made to supply capital, since it was, in effect, the only productive sector of the backward society. Preobrazhensky realized that the peasants could hardly cooperate on a voluntary basis, and thus advocated, quote, exploitation through taxation and unequal exchange. Preobrazhensky did not, it is true, carry the argument to the argument's logical, if extreme, conclusion, the forced and complete domination of the whole private sector, but the implications of Preobrazhensky's arguments were abundantly clear, and in any case it was apparent to Preobrazhensky that the new economic policy was essentially a self-defeating policy. So long as the private sector remained unexploited, industrialization was impossible. The new economic policy was an attempt, in Preobrazhensky's view, to reconcile the irreconcilable, two economic forms not only in conflict with each other, but each determined to destroy the other. Obviously, in a confrontation of this nature, a workers' government could not remain neutral. This latter was the political aspect of the question. The economic aspect was that there was no way except state intervention, which led to the development of a backward economy. If Preobrazhensky was the economic theoretician behind the left, Trotsky was the left's leading political figure and spokesman. Footnote: the views of Stalin, who at the outset sided with the Bukharin position, will be referred to in the context of the discussion on, quote, socialism in one country in Chapter 9 below. End footnote. Trotsky never, it is true, interpreted the concept of, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, end quote, in quite the extreme and rigid fashion which characterized primitive socialist accumulation's use by Preobrazhensky, and there were not a few other differences between the two men. Footnote: the main difference was over the extent of the Soviet economy's dependence on the world economy. Trotsky believed it was much greater than Preobrazhensky assumed. End footnote. Nevertheless, the logic of Preobrazhensky's views, Nevertheless, the logic of Trotsky's views was not far removed from that of Preobrazhensky. We've already seen the affinity to Preobrazhensky's ideas in Trotsky's economic writings and pronouncements prior to 1924. Thereafter, Trotsky pursued a line consistent with Trotsky's earlier position. Trotsky's main economic work of this period was a pamphlet written in 1925 and devoted to the query of its title, Towards Capitalism or Socialism. It was, in fact, an extremely optimistic work, concerned to show throughout how successful the Soviet economy had been steered in the direction of the socialist sector. With all the dangers inherent in the new economic policy, the Soviet regime, according to Trotsky, had nevertheless been able to exploit the new economic policy's framework for the regime's own long-term goals. So sanguine, in fact, was Trotsky that Trotsky could hardly imagine any other development in the future. Yet throughout the pamphlet there ran one basic set of assumptions: that agriculture would be an adjunct of industry, that the priorities of industry would take precedence, and that the struggle against the, quote, bourgeois village would be intensified and extended. In arguing that the Soviet economy had been moving away from capitalism and towards socialism, Trotsky attributed this trend to the exploitation of the natural advantages which the state sector enjoyed under a socialist government. Without denouncing the original conception of the new economic policy, Trotsky nevertheless questioned the new economic policy's validity for the future. The new economic policy was introduced, Trotsky wrote, to, quote, develop the productive forces as a basis for social development in general, end quote. By this, Trotsky clearly meant that the private sector was allowed to flourish in order the better to exploit the private sector later for the state sector. Where am I? Thus, at the outset, the two parts of the mixed economy are allowed to struggle against each other, but such a conception, in Trotsky's view, was no longer adequate, and to assure the triumph of the state sector had to be given the necessary political support and economic advantages. Trotsky repeated over and over that, in any case, the fundamental problems of agricultural production could not be solved unless Russia was industrialized. Thus, the latter goal was as much a matter of general economic reconstruction as of socialism, and the two, of course, were far from incompatible, in fact complementary. The danger remained, however, that the continued existence of private agriculture would lead to bourgeois stratification in the countryside, thus mitigating against the eventual socialization of agriculture. The aim should therefore be intensified industrial development. If the, quote, growth of industry will keep ahead of the process of stratification amongst the peasantry and neutralize it, end quote. It will have created a, quote, technical basis and economic possibilities for a gradual transition to collective farming, end quote. Trotsky, towards socialism or capitalism. The last is a fair illustration of Trotsky's approach to the issue of collectivization. Like others on the left, Trotsky did not have an immediate plan for collectivization. In Trotsky's attitude to the transition to collective farming, Trotsky was closer to Bukharin than the divergence of their general views might lead one to believe. Like Bukharin, Trotsky did not think that this transition could be forced, but rather that this transition was a function of cultural and technical development, and that it depended as well on the prior domination of the economy by industry. Nevertheless, Trotsky's views, and those of the left in general, on collectivization were at variance with the logic of the policies Trotsky advocated. Put another way, Trotsky's economic arguments at least implied that a strong hand was necessary in dealing with the peasants. How else, after all, could Trotsky expect industry to get the initiative over agriculture? And how else could, quote, primitive socialist accumulation, end quote, be fulfilled? In 1927, as his political career was coming to an end, in November of the year, Trotsky would be expelled from the party and in January 1928 deported to Alma-Ata. Trotsky became more forthright on these issues. In September, Trotsky drew up, together with 12 other members of the joint opposition, a long document, which came to be known as the, quote, opposition platform, for submission to the party's 15th Congress. This expounded the opposition's views on economic and political matters. Footnote. A copy of the Russian original of this work is in the Trotsky archives. To facilitate quotation, however, reference in what follows are to the English translation by Max Eastman and Leon Trotsky's The Real Situation in Russia, published in New York in 1928, hereafter referred to as, quote, platform. Incidentally, the, quote, platform was never submitted to the Congress, since in November 1927, a month before the Congress was to meet, Trotsky and other members of the opposition were expelled from the party. End footnote. The, quote, platform is, of course, an attack on Stalin's leadership, but the platform takes the form of a detailed criticism of current economic policies. Unlike towards socialism or capitalism, the platform is pessimistic in tone, arguing that recent developments have constituted a setback for the socialist sector and are leading towards class differentiation in agriculture. Many passages are devoted to showing the growth of the kulak danger and the simultaneous forsaking of the poor and middle peasants. A full chapter is devoted to the condition of the workers, which is seen as having seriously deteriorated. The work, however, the platform, is not simply a list of indictments, but argues a central thesis of the platform's own. This is that the only policy for both for the reconstruction of the economy and the economy's preparation for socialism is the policy which gives absolute precedence to industrialization. Any other approach will not only curtail industrial development, but will also fail to revitalize agriculture. In fact, the whole economic portion of the work may be said to be devoted to the principle that, quote, only a powerful socialized industry can help the peasants transform agriculture along collectivist lines, end quote. The platform. The argument is presented in such a way as to imply that the Soviet economy is now at a crossroads, and that the pace of industrialization must be drastically stepped up if the socialist character of the Soviet regime and of the future society is to be preserved. The backwardness of agriculture is attributed to the backwardness of industry. Quote, the inadequate tempo of development in industry leads, to a retardation of the growth of agriculture, end quote. The platform. But how is the tempo to be accelerated? In a subsection devoted to this very question, the platform lists a number of measures to this end. But the most far-reaching is clearly the proposal to increase substantially the taxation of the, quote, upper layers of the peasants and the new bourgeoisie in general, end quote, in accordance with the, quote, growth of accumulation, end quote, amongst these strata. Footnote. Elsewhere, the, quote, platform speaks of the necessity of making the, quote, kulak, quote, as the renter of land, wholly and absolutely, subject to supervision and control from the organs of the Soviet power in the countryside, end quote, the platform, and this in order to facilitate the nationalization of land. End footnote. Yet concurrently with the attack on the kulak, the, quote, platform proposes a positive program aimed at winning over to collectivism the poor peasants. Clearly what is envisaged is the exploitation of the class struggle in the countryside, sharpened by the growth of class differentiation. Quote, the growth of private proprietorship in the country must be offset by a more rapid development of collective farming. It is necessary systematically and from year to year to subsidize the efforts of the poor peasants to organize in collectives. End quote. Trotsky, the platform. In all this, there is no direct suggestion of compulsion, and the use of force may be said to be implied only in dealing with the recalcitrant kulaks. However, the element of confrontation with the peasantry is clearly evident in the whole approach of the, quote, platform. And while the platform expresses the belief that collectivism in the countryside will develop of collectivism's own in the course of time and with the rise in cultural and technical standards, the platform sees the need for an economic policy which is not dependent on such standards alone, but capable, before their attainment, of consolidating the penetration into agriculture of socialist organization. Footnote. See especially the section on, quote, cooperation. End footnote. Okay, so that's the end of the section on Trotsky's thoughts on the new economic policy and Baruch Knei-Paz's The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. Thank you so much for listening.